Sue, for having me back at the Physicians Roundtable. I assume everybody can hear me okay? This is the third in my series on how treatment guidelines are being used to conduct an experiment on not only the American public, but the international public with respect to Lyme disease. This talk is more about the agenda of how this, what I call a synthetic epidemic, ties in with a vaccine marketing strategy, which was outlined in a CDC paper, which I'm going to cover. Okay, so this is an overview of the talk. I'm going to give just an overview of the status of the epidemic. I'm going to go over the curious disease distribution and discuss whether it's through incompetence or design. And I'm going to go through a little bit of the history of the Steere-Camp creating a treatment denial situation, the history of false information that they've spread, and the institutionalization of corruptions through the treatment guidelines. And then that's all going to tie into the vaccine marketing agenda, which is basically run by the pharmaceuticals industry. And again, I'm going to go over this blueprint article which outlines the strategy that I think they're employing, which I think explains the decades of incompetence and corruption. A little bit about me. I'm actually an industrial physicist. I've been in the private industry for over 25 years as an engineer, both in the microelectronics industry and now in the micro-optics industry. I'm also the author of 3 books on unethical medical experimentation. You can look them up online. I'm also a tick-borne disease victim, was bitten by a tick in North Carolina, and was fortunate enough to have a world-class expert in my town. And I recovered under long-term antibiotics treatment. My doctor was eventually put out of business by the North Carolina medical boards, but I continued under his care in other states and also through some unconventional means, and I'm pretty much fully recovered now. But anyway, this long-term treatment, which is necessary for a lot of Lyme patients, is under full-scale assault by profit-oriented interests using what I call a third-party strategy, which gives them the appearance of working under scientific consensus, which is not, and it's actually all carried out through the national security infrastructure for protection. Okay, again, I covered a lot of what I want to say in my presentation last year. You can Google my name, Jerry Leonard, Connecting the Dots if you want the full presentation. I'm just going to give some highlights today and get more into the vaccine marketing aspect of the disease. But last year I went over some of the links between Lyme disease and biowarfare just real quickly. These are some of the connections between Lyme disease and various either biowarfare researchers or biowarfare epidemiologists. For example, the name of the illness, Lyme, Connecticut, is directly across from Plum Island, which is a biowarfare lab that did tick research off the coast of Long Island. The namesake of the Lyme pathogen is named after William Gopher, who's a biowarfare researcher. And the namesake of the culturing medium is Alan Barber, who invented it at a biowarfare lab. He now directs a biowarfare lab. The namesake of the School of Treatment Denial, Alan Steere, so-called Steere-Camp. He's the CDC biowarfare officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. The lead author of the foremost study used to justify the Steere-Camp of treatment denial is named Mark Klempner, and he directs a biowarfare lab. And the lead author of the treatment guidelines themselves, which are used to deny Lyme victims treatment, is Gary Wormser, who lectures on biowarfare. So 2 of these individuals above are actually biowarfare lab directors, as I mentioned, Alan Barber and Mark Klempner. And 3 of them have actually led the Lyme vaccine efforts, Alan Barber, Alan Steere, and Gary Wormser. So if Lyme disease is hard to catch and easy to cure situation, why are there so many biowarfare experts involved? Obviously, it's not easy to cure. It's very hard to cure. So just an update on the epidemic. This is a Wikipedia article stating that Lyme disease is the most common tick-borne disease in the Northern Hemisphere. And the epidemic is now raging out of control. This is an article just from a month ago to today, I think, saying that this is the worst summer yet for Lyme disease. This is mid-page today. Within the last year or so, there have been numerous emergency Lyme disease task forces in various states, Virginia, Massachusetts, towns like Ridgefield, Connecticut, counties, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. These are links. I'm going to have this presentation on the internet after the presentation. You can look these up. We have an epidemic of ear ticks closing down campsites in Cape Cod. We have tick alerts being given in Maryland. And even as far south as Texas, we have, in this report, about a quarter of the ticks found in Texas have Lyme disease, which is outrageous. And again, this is a key phrase. Most doctors will say there's no Lyme disease in Texas. This is the theme repeated over and over again. We have this epidemic raging, but the doctors are being told that there's no Lyme disease in their state. So the question is, where are these doctors getting their information, and why is this information continually proven wrong with no repercussions? And it is continually proven wrong. This is in the UK. It's an article stating that the ticks that can transmit Lyme disease may be more prevalent in the UK than realized. It can be transmitted through the dog ticks. And experts suspect the problem is even bigger. My home state of North Carolina, retractions with respect to Lyme disease, that ticks actually can carry Lyme disease in North Carolina. This is an article I showed last year in the Raleigh News Observer. State affirms Lyme disease danger. States, after years of cautioning that people were unlikely to get Lyme disease in North Carolina, state health leaders are now advising that tick-borne illness can in fact be acquired here. That's where I caught it. This is another story of a mother trying to get treatment for her children, and she said, even when a Lyme test came back positive, the doctors still questioned the diagnosis. So it's very difficult to get treated, and even if you get a positive test, the doctors are filled with false information and they may not even treat you. So the question is, why did they deny the obvious for so long, causing suffering for countless patients like me and doctors like mine, who was eventually put out of business in North Carolina? Well, the problem is these so-called health leaders, and a lot of them are coordinating policy with a group within the CDC called the Epidemic Intelligence Service, which is a biodefense group. And they're the seat of the problem because they're actually helping to perpetuate the epidemic under the pretext of treating it. Again, this is in the UK, just showing that the Lyme disease epidemic is international. This is the number of disease cases in England and Wales has almost tripled since 2002, so that's 10 years. And back to the United States, this is a SUNY professor stating that Lyme disease is diagnosed by physicians at rates that may be 10 to 50 times higher than what the public health statistics show. So think about that, 10 to 50 times higher than what the officials are admitting. So I ask, are the public health statistics deliberately underplaying the epidemic? I believe they are. This is an article from British Columbia stating that the officials are failing to inform the public massively, stating that they failed to promptly disclose at least 2 pieces of critical information about tick-borne Lyme disease. And it was a particular study that showed that the cases may be up to 25 times more numerous than the official estimates. So again, 25 times more numerous than the previous official estimates. Something major is going on here. So I think not only are the public health statistics being deliberately underplayed, but the epidemic is largely the result of public health policy. So I believe Lyme disease is a politically created epidemic, largely, and it's actually being perpetuated by the very agencies who should be stopping it, but they have a hidden agenda. And I call this a contrived epidemic spiraling out of control. I have a website which has a presentation on this, of this very title. Hundreds of thousands of patients with a year are being allowed to contract a physically disabling and mentally incapacitating disease. And the complexity of the disease and its contagious nature is being hidden from them and the doctors, allowing the disease to spread. And the treatment denial for the disease is actually coordinated at a very high level. And the spread of the disease, which results, is consistent with a vaccine development strategy and a marketing strategy outlined in the CDC paper, which I'm going to go over extensively in the second half. So I think this is the blueprint for the so-called Steere-Camp of Lyme disease treatment. The article is called The Cost Effectiveness of Vaccination Against Lyme Disease, and this is actually a CDC publication. And the lead author, Martin Meltzer, is actually, I believe, a CDC or an EIS officer. He's given presentations at EIS conferences, and he's written on biological warfare. So if a vaccine against Lyme is expensive and has a very low probability of actually working, has major side effects, and requires multiple shots over periods of months or years, how do you make such a vaccine look cost effective? Well, the question is, cost effective compared to what? If you make the alternative an untreated epidemic from a complex illness with a horrific array of debilitating and deadly symptoms, you can make just about any vaccine look cost effective. So this talk will address exactly why and how this is being done. Basically, if you control the definition of the disease, you can control how it is or is not treated, and you can make a lot of money. So I claim that the CDC is actually coordinating with the pharmaceuticals industry to deny patients treatment. I want to go over a precedent for how this has been done in the past. Of course, this is the infamous Tuskegee experiment, which went on for over 40 years. This is a statement by Dr. Colin Ross, who says that this experiment establishes that a large network of doctors and organizations are willing to participate in, fund, and condone grossly unethical medical experimentation into the 70s. And curiously, just as the Tuskegee experiment was being shut down in the early 70s, the Lyme epidemic began raging. So this is a recent article about the Tuskegee experiment. It was actually an international experiment, and they were actually not only denying treatment, they were injecting people with syphilis. And this is a New York Times article stating that the highest medical and legal officials in the American government and experts at Harvard and other top med schools actually approved these disease experiments. They state that the ethical errors were made by a startling array of public health luminaries, the Surgeon General, the Attorney General, Army and Navy officials, the President of the American Medical Association, the President of the National Academy of Sciences, and experts in Harvard, Johns Hopkins, etc. So it shows that top officials of government, health, legal, scientific, and military agencies, in conjunction with private medical societies and top academic institutions, colluded in an experiment to make people sick. And I believe this is still going on with respect to Lyme disease. They actually published the results of their study over a period of decades. This is one of the articles. They actually plotted the life expectancy of people that were victims of treatment denial and described how the life expectancy in the syphilitic group was actually reduced, and they plotted the results. They even stated, so far we were keeping the known positive patients from getting treatment. So they were proud of what they were doing. So the rationale for all this is point number 2. If you have a chronic disease, such as syphilis, this necessitates a long-term study of the natural history of the disease before the effectiveness of programs for the control of the disease can be evaluated. So you need to understand what the disease can do untreated before you can really determine if your treatments are effective. And if it's a chronic disease like syphilis or Lyme, then you have to do that over a long period of time. That's what they did. So they've actually done experiments like the syphilis experiments long before Tuskegee started. This is from the 1800s. Doctors were injecting people with syphilis as part of the vaccine agenda. And I believe these experiments are still going on. This is a quote by Edmund Burke. Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So I'm trying to give you a little history here so we can hopefully prevent this experiment from going on. Again, this is how I believe the Tuskegee experiment I call phase 2 is going on. This is in my presentation from last year. I'm not going to go over this year, but this is on YouTube. You can look it up. Just Google connecting the dots under my name. So the Lyme and syphilis disease agents are actually very similar. This is an article that states the Borrelia burgdorferi is amazingly similar to the spirochete that causes syphilis. This is the Wikipedia article which is showing that under the spirochete label, the spirochete that causes syphilis and Lyme are very closely related. And they both cause 3-phase infections, starting out with skin diseases and can end up with neurological problems. So how is this being carried out? Tuskegee phase 1, patients were isolated and they were kept from seeing doctors outside of the experimental system that the Public Health Service had set up. I believe Tuskegee phase 2 is being conducted by keeping doctors from treating patients outside of so-called treatment guidelines. So we have this massive tick infestation and this Lyme epidemic raging in the northeast of the United States. So is there a war on the ticks? No, there's actually a war on the doctors who treat diseases that the ticks are spreading. This is an article from the Poughkeepsie Journal. Has anybody been keeping up with this series? It's a really fantastic series. Actually one of the only newspapers in the country reporting accurate information on the Lyme disease epidemic. So they state that the prime target is not an army of ticks. In the bullseye is a handful of doctors, specifically those who dispense long-term antibiotics for the illness, which is required in a lot of cases. For example, that's what got me better. And they state at least 5 doctors in Dutchess County are under investigation by state licensing officials. It's the state officials that are doing the dirty work in the pharmaceuticals industry. This is an article I showed last year. This is from the Roanoke Times, stating that upwards of 30 doctors, most of them in the Lyme-riddled northeastern states, have been sanctioned in the past decade. So, as a result of all this, there are very few physicians that want to treat Lyme disease. They don't want to be put out of business. This is an article stating that among almost 300 primary care physicians in Connecticut, which is ground zero for the Lyme disease, only 2% are willing to treat chronic Lyme. So this is a public health disaster. So why is this happening? Basically, I believe it's a marketing strategy on the part of the pharmaceuticals industry. They're bullying doctors, which is an ongoing trend, through treatment guidelines, which is a new manifestation. This is an article published by the Australian that showed that the pharmaceuticals company actually drew up a hit list of doctors that they wanted to get rid of because they were a threat to their profits. They had to be neutralized or discredited because they criticized the drug that the pharmaceutical company was selling. The drug firms also bully and investigate the FDA officials. They have numerous ways of swaying doctor prescriptions to make money, and it's working. This is an article showing that, for example, antidepressants, the use has skyrocketed over 400% in the past 20 years, and they're prescribing antipsychotics in nursing homes, jails. Children in foster care are getting 3 and 4 drugs simultaneously administered to them. Younger and younger children are given antipsychotics, and now they're even so-called pre-drugging the kids because they look like they might have psychotic illness. Psychosis risk syndrome is what they're calling it. And now they're even giving babies drugs in the womb, believe it or not. So all the pharmaceuticals companies have to do is figure out how to treat dead people, and they'll have the market cornered. This is a case where they actually had a SWAT team assault a mother who was trying to protect her child from getting treated with antipsychotics. Anybody familiar with this case? The mother actually held off the SWAT team with a pistol because she didn't want to administer antipsychotics to her daughter, and her doctor had told her not to. She eventually was taken to jail, and she was eventually vindicated. This is a very interesting story. Mike Adams has covered it in Natural News. Mike Adams is a great source of information if you guys aren't familiar with it. I would get on his news list. It's called Natural News. Mike Adams. Just a quick survey of how powerful the pharmaceuticals industry routinely paying billion-dollar fines, and they just pay it because they make more money selling drugs. They can recoup the cost with their profits. And treatment guidelines are just another way of dictating profits and bullying doctors. This is a recent article called Guidelines, Guides to Profit, which explains how financial relationships have corrupted the whole guideline process. This is an article I showed last year that showed that these treatment guidelines, even though they're becoming more and more prevalent, they're based largely on so-called level 3 evidence, which is opinion, which makes them very dangerous. This article states that physicians should remain very cautious when using treatment guidelines as the sole source of patient care, but unfortunately a lot of them do, because we put out of business in a lot of cases if they don't. And this is another article which I showed last year showing that compliance with treatment guidelines may actually be fatal. You may actually do more damage than your patients than if you did treat it according to the treatment guidelines. So, apply this to Lyme disease. This is the infamous Attorney General Blumenthal's investigation of the IDSA treatment guidelines for Lyme disease. He found that the process in which they were drafted was riddled with corruption. They were forced to revisit their guidelines, but they held a hearing and they ended up not changing anything. So they just went on as business as usual with these guidelines that are keeping thousands and thousands of people sick. So this is all due to what's called the Steere-Camp of Lyme disease treatment. This is Alan Steere. This is a Wikipedia article just showing the so-called Lyme disease controversy. Steere's support for the medical view that patients with chronic Lyme disease often have no evidence of Lyme disease, so therefore they don't get treated. This is what some people call protecting patents and not patients. And this all ties into a Lyme disease vaccine, which Alan Steere was heavily involved with. He actually led the research effort for the Lyme race, which was a GlaxoSmithKline vaccine. So Alan Steere is famous for saying that Lyme disease is overdiagnosed and overtreated. In other words, it's also hard to catch and easy to cure. There's an interesting article in the New York Times, article about Steere. It's called Stalking Dr. Steere Over Lyme Disease. It states, in the realm of Lyme disease, few are as influential as Dr. Steere. Interestingly, a lot of his patients seem to despise him. It says, last year, Dr. Alan Steere, one of the world's renowned medical researchers and rheumatologists, began to fear his patients. The reason he feared them was because he wouldn't treat them in a lot of cases. The world's foremost expert on his illness did not believe many of them even had Lyme disease, and he refused to treat them with antibiotics, mainly long-term antibiotics. So if the world's foremost expert on a disease doesn't want to treat you for it, what do? You can go get a second opinion. but it gets better or worse depending on your perspective. Due to Steere's influence, insurance companies have refused to pay for continuing treatments for Lyme. So even if you had a second opinion and a doctor who wanted to treat you, a lot of times they'll give you insurance coverage, and if they're not put out of business, you will have to pay out of pocket. It's happening all over the country. It happened to my doctor. So this is the diagram I try to explain, just an overview of how these treatment guidelines are used by pharmaceuticals and insurance companies to deny patients treatment, and they do it indirectly. So the pharmaceuticals companies and the insurance companies would love to be able to tell doctors how to prescribe, because they make a lot of money if they can force a doctor to give patients their drugs. But that would be too obvious, so they use treatment guidelines. So they can point to the treatment guidelines and say, this is the best evidence, this is what you need to give your patients. That would be one way to do it, but even that would be a little too obvious. So they've used this so-called third-party strategy, where they fund these third-party groups to draft these treatment guidelines. There's an article by Teresa Forcados who says they promote organizations that appear to be spontaneous initiatives and are in reality supported and run by citizens that work for the pharmaceuticals companies. So these third-party groups include nonprofits, medical societies like the IDSA, which have these thought leaders like the Steere-Camp experts and the continuing education groups, and they all point to these treatment guidelines, which allows the pharmaceuticals companies to dictate treatment guidelines kind of on the dotted line, and that restricts choice for medical treatment for patients, which ends up translating into money for the pharmaceuticals companies and feeds back into the system and gives them more money to control the entire system. So who benefits from this whole system? Well, Alan Steere and the company he was, or the university he was working for, Yale Corporation, was actually working on a vaccine the whole time he was denying patients antibiotics in the early days of the Lyme epidemic. And he actually followed through and led the field study on the first Lyme vaccine, the Lyme-Rix vaccine. This is a disaster for patients because it induced the very symptoms it was supposed to prevent. OspA vaccine was pulled from the market. This is an article by Steere stating that the way they developed the vaccine was they had a unique set of serum samples from untreated patients, which were monitored throughout the course of the Lyme disease in the late 70s prior to the use of antibiotic therapy for this illness. What he doesn't say is that Steere was one of the main reasons that they didn't have antibiotic therapy for the illness. So this allows him and his employer to monitor the immune response of these patients that can develop a vaccine. He states, only with this set of serum samples is it possible to determine how the antibody response to Borrelia burgdorferi develop and change during the various stages of the illness. So they were actually able to watch the immune system over a long period of time so they can map it out and try to mimic it in a vaccine. This is a more recent article explaining this rationale. If you monitor the immune response directed against multiple spirochetal proteins generated throughout the course of infection, you can use that information to develop a vaccine. This is a statement by Karen Forshner, who is the founder of the Lyme Disease Foundation. She states that we're trying to find answers, and the biggest problem is self-appointed gatekeepers like Alan Steere. Well, we now know that Steere is not a self-appointed gatekeeper. He's a CDC biowarfare epidemiologist and a pharmaceuticals consultant. And he's been wrong from the very beginning of the epidemic. But he's always wrong in the right direction for pharmaceuticals interests, and coincidentally, he's a pharmaceuticals consultant. He's also right in the direction for vaccine research and symptom treatment. So this is just a quick overview of the Steere-Camp history. So they initially denied antibiotics work at all against Lyme disease. They stated it was a virus. So they had recommended no antibiotics be given. Then they suddenly switched positions and claimed that antibiotics were nearly miraculous, and therefore only short courses of antibiotics were necessary. And they still maintain that long-term antibiotics is useless and even dangerous. They even call some doctors who administered them murderers. The Kleppner study on long-term antibiotics administration did not even administer long-term antibiotics as part of the Steere-Camp. So these positions have an overarching coherence. They're designed to deny long-term antibiotics administration for Lyme disease, which is often necessary. So these Steere-Camp positions have been institutionalized in the infamous treatment guidelines. Lead author was Gary Wormser. They were actually investigated by Attorney General of Connecticut, Blumenthal, as I mentioned. But curiously, in order to be an expert on Lyme disease, you have to be a member of the so-called Steere-Camp of treatment denial. This is just a quick overview of some of Steere's publications over the years. This is his paper in 1993 stating that Lyme disease was overdiagnosed. This is the start of the hard to catch, easy to cure mythology that's been perpetuated. This is one of Steere's early papers from the 70s where he stated that Lyme disease may be caused by a virus. It wasn't that symptomatic treatment only is advised. This is a common theme throughout the epidemic. This is a book written by Jonathan Edlow called Bullseye. He states, if the causative agent was shown to be a bacterium, then the imperative to treat would have been greater. So by calling it a Lyme, or proposing that it was a Lyme virus, this provided them with an excuse not to treat people with antibiotics, because you don't treat viruses with antibiotics. This is another paper that Steere published. This is a non-existing tick vector that he claims was correlated with the Lyme disease epidemic, Exodes damini. Turned out this species of tick didn't even exist. Again, Dr. Edlow states that the change in nomenclature was not without its effect, for it meant that doctors could not legitimately make a diagnosis of Lyme disease in states where the vector was not found. So this was just another excuse for restricting the treatment of Lyme disease. It turned out the species of tick didn't even exist. So Steere and his cohorts have been making a career doing research on a disease that they say pretty much doesn't exist, at least in the long term. Another statement by Steere in a publication in the 70s, he stated that we remain skeptical that antibiotic therapy helps. Of course, it's universally treated with antibiotic therapy now. And again, he says that this is in 1978, it appears that at this point that only symptomatic treatment is feasible. Again, this is the common theme. And this is an article from just several months ago, and Steere is still stating the same, taking the same position. This is a New York Times article. They're claiming that when patients relapse, it's largely due to new infections instead of the relapse. This is the big controversy over Lyme disease, whether it's a relapsing disease due to an ongoing infection. In the New York Times article, they state that Steere admits that the symptoms, sometimes disabling ones, do linger for months after treatment, in as many as 10% of his patients. The doctors do not know why, but Dr. Steere said antibiotics are not the answer. So if there's one thing Steere knows, it's antibiotics are not the answer. This is one of his papers stating that 1 or 2 months of antibiotics with doxycycline should be sufficient. And if it's not, then he treats with anti-inflammatory agents. Again, with doxycycline, this is Dr. Wormser's paper. Wormser, again, is the lead author of the treatment guidelines. He states that even a single dose of doxycycline can prevent the development of Lyme disease if you're bitten by a tick. So the media just regurgitates this so-called Steere-Camp propaganda. This is a New York Times article stating that basically Lyme disease can be stopped in its tracks with a single dose of antibiotic, which is ridiculous because I don't know of any disease that can be stopped with a single dose of antibiotic, especially one that's the most complicated in the world. So I ask, is any statement too absurd for these establishment Lyme experts? Curiously, these doxycycline treatments actually induce so-called round body formation and a quiescence of symptoms rather than a cure, which means the disease can go into remission and appear to be cured only to come back later and wreak havoc. So I ask, why are the world's foremost experts on Lyme disease recommending treatments that are likely to reduce the organism to form a protective cyst, and thereby cause a relapsing, undetectable, and possibly incurable form of disease? So this is a summary statement from Dr. Ed Masters on the history of errors by the Steere-Camp. He states, first off, they said Lyme disease was a new disease, which it isn't, or wasn't. Then it was thought to be viral, but it isn't. Then it was thought that seronegativity didn't exist, which it does. Then they thought it was easily treated by short courses of antibiotics, which it sometimes isn't. Then it was only the Exodes damini tick, which we now know is not even a separate valid tick species. So Masters goes on to say, if you look throughout history, almost every time a major dogmatic statement has been made about what we know about this disease, it was subsequently proven wrong or underwent major modifications. So what do all these errors have in common? Wrong in the right direction. They effectively justify symptom treatment only for Lyme disease, which is what Steere's been proposing since the early 70s. So these policies, I claim, are tailor-made to make the disease very difficult to diagnose, very dangerous to treat for doctors, and very expensive to treat for patients.